Hey guys, this is Mr. Dutton, and this is going to be our weekly lecture for biology class. This week we're going to be talking about biodiversity. Before we get started, I want to remind you guys to go find the electronic note sheet or whatever instructions your teacher has given you for taking notes during this. There's some good tables in that and some good spots for you to write down the information. So if you need to find that, hit pause and go find that before we get started. All right, once you got your worksheet, let's start talking about biodiversity. And so we may have some different ideas, different thoughts and preconceived notions of what that means. So let's go ahead and write, like, what do we think biodiversity is? I mean, you've probably heard this word before, but what does it mean to you? Let's take a second, hit pause, and write down your thoughts on that. All right, so hopefully you've written down what you thought biodiversity is, and let's compare that to what we've got. It's probably not going to be the same because we've got some pretty technical jargon in ours. But biodiversity is a measurement of the ecosystem, genetic, and species diversity in an area. Higher species richness, abundance, and evenness suggest a more biodiverse area. So take a second, hit pause, write that down in your sheet as our actual definition of biodiversity for this class. All right, as you've gotten that written down, let's go ahead and look at our three different types of biodiversity. And these are all mentioned in that definition. But our three main types are going to be ecosystem diversity, genetic diversity, and species diversity. And ecosystem diversity is the range and variation of habitat type and spaces in a region. So if we look at these two pictures, here's a kind of like a tropical rainforest looking thing, and then like a tree plantation over to the right. In that tropical rainforest, you can see there's lots and lots of different habitats, like some dying and falling trees. There's like some shaded understory. There's like the canopy. There's big leaves. There's small leaves. There's a lot going on there. There's lots of little nooks and crannies and places where different organisms could make a living. Over on that top right in that tree plantation, we've got low ecosystem diversity. There's not as many different habitats. There's not as many different types of places to live there. So we would think that it might have different numbers and types of organisms there. Our second type of biodiversity is genetic diversity. And this is the range and variation of DNA differences within one species in a region. And so we're looking at, in this case, cheetahs and some type of a bivalve here. And so if we look at some of these things are things that we can actually look at and measure as what we call the phenotype or kind of the outside appearance of genetics. And so if we look at these bivalves here, you can see some of these have some like stripes, some of these have like rings, some are solid color. The color ranges from like almost bluish purple to red to yellow to tan. There's a lot of variation in that. So we could say that's probably showing that there's a high amount of genetic diversity in that species. On the other hand, some of these we have to actually do some lab type tests to measure. And so one thing we found out through our lab measurements is that cheetahs have a very low genetic variation. This can be caused for a lot of reasons. One of those could be small population sizes or inbreeding. There's other things, even just the natural history of the way that an animal or plant makes its living that can cause low genetic variety or variation. Our third type is species diversity, and this is the range and variation of species in a region. And this is the one that we're going to focus on as we go forward. Ecosystem and genetic diversity are really, really important, but sometimes they're kind of hard to measure. There's lots of some specialized techniques or tools that we may need to do with that. But species diversity gives us a way that we can actually measure stuff here in a classroom and virtually to see what the biodiversity of an ecosystem might be. So let's go ahead and focus on that. And so just looking at these three, here are three ecosystems, ecosystem A, B, and C. So just based on what we know already, which one would you say is more diverse? So go ahead and hit pause and look at these. You can see some different animals there, different numbers of different animals. But hit pause and decide which one has the highest biodiversity. All right, so hopefully you've made a prediction, and maybe even better, you've given me a prediction and a reason why, or given me some evidence or rationale to explain or support your decision. So let's look at some of the ways that we actually measure this. I'll jump back to this. It can be hard to just look at something and say, oh, wow, well, this one looks more diverse. So let's actually look at some measurements or some like calculations we can do to actually give us some support for our decisions. So our three main ways that we measure biodiversity, specifically species biodiversity, are species richness, species abundance, and species evenness. And these we have to do these in order, or it helps to do these in order. because kind of they help us calculate each other, or each one helps us calculate the next. So species richness is just the number of species in the area. So we just look at all the different organisms and kind of sort them into species and just count the number. The number of species, not the number of individuals. Species abundance, though, is the number of organisms in each species. So we're going to have one measure of species abundance for each of the species that are in our ecosystem. And then finally, species evenness is kind of comparing those species abundances. So we're looking at how similar or different the species abundances are between the different species that are in the ecosystem. And so let's go through some of these, maybe some new words. Make sure to put those in your word bank, and make sure that we cover those and that you understand them by the time we're done. If not, go talk to your teacher later. Make sure you get clarity on those. So let's look at these three and how we actually measure these. So let's go back to ecosystem A. And so we may, some people may have said this one looked pretty diverse. Cool. So let's actually get some support and some numbers that actually tell us that it is diverse. So our first step is to measure the richness. And our first step of measuring the richness is to just sort the organisms into different species. And so here it looks like I've got them in like 4 different categories, 4 different species. There's like some lions, some bears, some dogs, and some horses. And so in that case, I would just say that my richness is 4 species. So I've got 4 different species here. That's just my richness, just counting the number of different species that are there. Our next step is to look at abundance, our species abundances. And so in this case, we're going to have, because we have 4 species, our richness was 4, we're going to have 4 measurements of species abundance. So in this case, we count the number of lions, and then we find 4 lions. So we would say that the species abundance of lions is 4. We count the horses, and we find 4 horses. So we would say that the species abundance of horses is 4. And then we count the dogs. We find the species abundance of dogs is 4. And then we find the species abundance of bear is also 4. In this case, that was they happen to all be the same, but that doesn't always happen. So in this case, our species abundance for lion was 4, for horse was 4, for dog was 4, and bear was for 4. We wouldn't say the species abundance is 4. We wouldn't say the species abundance is 16. We're counting them for each individual species. So then our last step is looking at our evenness. And evenness, remember, is just comparing the abundances. So we already got our abundances. And in this case, our abundances were all exactly the same. So we can say that if our abundances are similar, we would say evenness is high. So in this case, they're very high. They're all the same. So our evenness is very high. If they're not similar, the evenness would be lower. This is more of a relative scale that we really use for comparing between ecosystems, not really for giving like an outright number. So in this case, we can just say it's high. And that'd be a good place to go. So in your note sheet, you should have a table that looks like this. And so based on ecosystem A, with the information we got, this is how I would want to fill this out. So we said our species richness was 4. I went ahead and wrote the 4 species that we found there for you. And so you can fill in the abundances for each species. Lion was 4, horse was 4, dog was 4, and bear was 4. And then we said that our evenness was high here. And so that's what I would want to know for ecosystem A. So we've got 3 measurements: richness, abundance, and evenness. And we have multiple measures of abundance, one for each of the species that was present in that ecosystem. If you need to fill that out, hit pause and go fill that out. All right, if you're back with us, let's go and look at ecosystem B. And so I've gone ahead and I've sorted these guys. So go ahead, hit pause, and calculate the species richness, the species abundance, and the evenness for ecosystem B. All right, hopefully you hit pause and calculated those 3, and you've written those numbers down in your table and the species names in the table. And so this is what I got. When I look at ecosystem B, I sorted those and I found 5 different species. So my richness is 5 species. I calculated the abundance for each of my 5 species. I got that bear had an abundance of 3, giraffe had an abundance of 1, lion had an abundance of 2, turtles had an abundance of 2, and horses had an abundance of 4. So in this case, I would say our evenness is moderate. They're not all the same, but there's nothing that really stands out. These numbers are fairly close to each other. Again, remember, evenness is really just more for comparison. We're not giving like an outright value for evenness. So go ahead, if you didn't get these, hit pause and get these numbers written in the table. If you did write these in the table, check your table compared to these numbers and make sure they are the same. All right, hopefully you should have these same numbers written down in your table for ecosystem B. Let's go ahead and move on to ecosystem C. And again, we'll do the same thing. We'll calculate the species richness, the species abundance, and the species evenness for ecosystem C and write that down on that table. Go ahead and hit pause now and calculate those. All right, hopefully you've got those numbers written down in your table. Let's see how your numbers compare to what I have. So I said that for ecosystem C, that I saw 4 different species. I saw camels, I saw kangaroos, I saw turtles, and I saw lions. So my richness is four species. And so I get the abundances for each of these. And I say that camel has an abundance of 2, kangaroo has an abundance of 1, turtle of 2, and lion has an abundance of 8. And so in this game, what's kind of cool here, I could kind of add some axes to these and make this into a cool bar graph if I wanted to. Add axes and labels and titles and all that fun stuff. So in this case, I would say the evenness is low. Of our 3, this is definitely the lowest evenness. And the reason for this is that there's so many lions, and there's a lot of lions, but there's only a couple of those other ones. So there's a difference in the abundances between my different species. So I guess the evenness was relatively low here. So go ahead, hit pause and check your table. Make sure your numbers are the same as this. All right, so now our next step is to go ahead and decide which one of our ecosystems has the highest biodiversity. So here are the numbers. You should have those also written in your table on your sheet as well. But go ahead and hit pause and make a claim. Why does or which one of these ecosystems do you say has the highest biodiversity? And then go ahead and add some supporting evidence for that. Give me some numbers and stuff. So go ahead and hit pause and write that up. All right, so we actually could have some different answers. This might not be a clear, cut and dry answer for this one. We need to kind of have a balance. We have 3 different measurements, and we could say that maybe different ones lead to different answers. If I had to pick one ecosystem, I'd probably argue that um, ecosystem A had high biodiversity, but you could also argue that ecosystem B had high biodiversity. If I had to pick one of these 3 that was probably the least biodiverse, it would probably be ecosystem C. Um, so I would say that ecosystem A has pretty high abundances for everything. It doesn't have the highest richness, but it's only one number off from the highest richness. So it only has one fewer species than the highest richness in our comparison. And the evenness is pretty high here. So it's got some good things going for it. It's definitely not a clear winner in everything. Ecosystem B it's got moderate evenness, but it definitely has a higher richness. So ecosystem B might win by the richness. It also has fewer of several of the organisms compared to ecosystem A or even ecosystem C. So again, not a clear winner, but I could argue ecosystem B. I could argue ecosystem A. It would be hard to argue for ecosystem C. So it does have the lower richness of these, but it really doesn't have much else going for it. Its evenness is low. The only real thing is it has abundant lions. But even though it has abundant lions, it has a low abundance of all the other species there. So I'd say ecosystem C here is the least diverse. But ecosystem A or maybe even B could be argued as our highest biodiversity. One thing that we're not going to do in this class, but I just wanted to show you guys, and this is some crazy looking math. I know it's really not that hard, but it was hard for us to kind of say like, oh, how do we balance these things? As you get further into some like ecology studies, there's some different indices or different measurements we can do where you just plug in all this information and it kind of summarizes it. It's an index, so it takes multiple measurements and summarizes them as just one number, and then we can compare that one number. And so sometimes this can be easier. The more we know and the more math we can do with it. And the better our data collection is, we can actually make it easier to come to some decision at the end and make a good claim and have evidence for that. Again, we're not going to do this for this class. If you're interested at all in how to do this, come talk to me and we can go through some. But it's actually pretty simple math once we get doing it. All right, so let's look at what happens when we do have high biodiversity. So we'd say that a high biodiversity is going to lead to a healthy ecosystem, or vice versa. It could be that a healthy ecosystem leads to high biodiversity, but these things go together. And so here's just a list of some of the things that we see when we get high biodiversity. We get these things. So we can like increase the ecosystem productivity. There's a specific niche or a specific place, a specific job, a specific role for each of the different species in an ecosystem. As you have more species, you have more ways that they can interact with each other, with those other biotic or even the abiotic factors in that ecosystem. We can support a larger number of plant species, and this can have a benefit for human, like growing greater variety of crops. We can, by having multiple types of organisms, we can protect different freshwater and soil resources and formation processes. We've got a bunch more of these. I'm not going to read through all these. You can skim through these on your own. But we have a lot of things that basically, when we have a when we have a high biodiversity, we have high abundance, high evenness, and high species richness. We have an ecosystem that can respond to um, problematic outside sources, um, or outside problems, and that can kind of work and allow each of the parts of it to work to their optimal. And this has helps a ecosystem be resilient and helps it to keep going the way it has, even in spite of diversity or adversity. Sorry, but it also, a lot of these end up being benefits for people. So we see some things on here like protecting fresh water, breaking down pollutants, things like stability and food resources and drugs and stuff. So recreation, even. So there's a lot of things that a healthy ecosystem with high biodiversity does that are good for people, even if we don't directly live in that ecosystem, but they provide some benefits. And so we call these things ecosystem services. And these are processes that naturally occur in an ecosystem that can benefit humans, that maybe we've taken advantage of, that we let the ecosystem do for us. And so let's look at a couple of those. And there's a whole bunch here. You can flip through these, or read through these. You can pause the video. But let's look at a couple specific ones. So one of these is pollination. And so this is a picture of a honeybee on an avocado flower. And so pollination is something where bees are just doing their thing. They're going out and they're finding food. And kind of a side effect of that is that it really helps us. Without pollinators, specifically these bees, a lot of our food crops, things that we grow for our own food, wouldn't be able to reproduce. So having bees as part of that ecosystem and part of that environment is something that's really irreplaceable for us. Humans can't have these foods without bees doing it. It would take a lot of work for us to do the job that the bees are doing on their own naturally. Another one is what like wetlands do. So these may look like swampy, gross places, but this is a picture of an upland bog in Wales. But there's wetlands all over the place. We have lots and lots around near us. But some things that healthy wetlands do is remove or sequester carbon. They can hold back some water to kind of minimize floods, and they clean water. So they have a lot and many more benefits that wetlands do. But these are things that if the wetland wasn't there, humans would have to like pay to do this and figure out how to do this through some type of technology or some type of industrial scale thing to get this stuff done, because it's things that we need. We need to kind of move carbon around through the carbon cycle. We need to keep water from flooding us. We need to have clean water so that we can drink and use to grow the plants that we're going to eat. Another one that's kind of cool that we don't think about much are these detritivores. So this is a dung beetle, and it actually goes around and it finds animal waste, and it kind of rolls it up in this ball and scoots it around, and it actually uses it or it gets the resources out of it. But other detritivores, things like vultures that are eating like dead animals on the side of the road. I mean, if that stuff wasn't there, all those things, the animal waste, the dead animals would like pile up and eventually like accumulate, and that would be like potential like health problems for us. But these organisms already get rid of it, kind of like there's this cleaning crew that's already there, that we don't have to like pay them extra or anything. They just, the fact that we can that they're there takes care of these jobs for us. And if they aren't there, then we have to go and figure out how do we get those jobs done. We also get some coral reefs, and so you can read through some of these examples. Here are a few more things. You can hit pause and check out what some of the things that coral reefs can do. Again, these are things that benefit humans. Oceans also have a lot of these, and we can look at these on large scale ecosystems and smaller ecosystems. And then kind of looking at some coastal wetlands, something like maybe Chesapeake Bay. So lots of benefits for people that live right there, but also for people that live maybe far away and utilize some of these resources. So that's all we've got. Again, make sure you're putting in any words that stood out, either new words or words that you still don't understand, put those in the word bank. If you've got any additional questions, please check in with your teacher, ask those questions, and hope this helped.